7 minutes ago, Buckingham Palace released an announcement that nobody believed it would ever make. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have been permanently excluded from the royal family. Not temporarily separated, not quietly distanced, but officially removed from royal ceremonies, private residences, family councils, and any possibility of future reconciliation. The wording was direct, the consequences were immediate, and behind palace walls, one signature turned a long-running family conflict into permanent exile. Before we dive deeper into what this truly means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another update. Harry read the announcement twice inside his California home before slowly gripping the edge of the table. Meghan watched him reach the words permanent exclusion, then gently took the page, placed it face down, and quietly said that the palace had finally admitted reconciliation was never really the goal. Buckingham Palace, the monarchy's central administrative headquarters, confirmed that the couple were prohibited from official ceremonies, private family gatherings held on royal property, institutional meetings, and restricted royal residences. This was no longer another reduction in royal duties. It marked a complete separation, shutting every remaining path back into royal life. King Charles signed the document inside Buckingham Palace, while Prince William sat across the desk. The king placed the pen down, removed his glasses, and remained silent. William showed no sign of celebration because his initials appeared beside the sovereign's approval, confirming that the future king had personally supported the decision. That detail mattered because the order extended far beyond the current reign. A confidential attachment explained that the restrictions would remain in place under future monarchs. Harry could no longer hope that the doors would reopen after his father's reign ended. Meghan remained composed, but her voice became firmer as she asked whether Charles had personally approved every line of the document. Harry quietly admitted that he no longer knew where his father ended and where the crown began. Then he noticed the date printed at the bottom of the approval page. The document had been prepared before the palace's final conversation with him. That discovery transformed his disappointment into anger. The last attempt at dialogue, the conversation he believed could repair their relationship, now appeared to have been little more than a final confirmation of a decision that had already been made. William stayed behind with Charles after the senior aides left the room. Neither man celebrated. The king stared silently at the signed document as though it had taken something from him, while the future monarch understood that protecting the institution had come at the cost of losing his brother. But before the palace could defend its decision, the people at the center of this family crisis were forced to confront everything they had lost, and everything they were still willing to sacrifice. Behind the formal language stood 4 people bound together by blood, marriage, resentment, and memories that none of them could erase. Charles was not simply excluding a duke. He was closing the door on his younger son. William was not merely defending the crown. He was sentencing his own brother to permanent distance. Meghan viewed the decision as undeniable proof of betrayal. Harry saw it as the final collapse of the family he had spent years insisting he still wanted. Charles returned alone to his private sitting room after the signing. Carrying a silence heavier than the document itself, the king opened an old photograph of his 2 sons as boys and stared at their faces while the tea beside him grew cold. His duty as sovereign, the responsibility to protect the future and stability of the monarchy, had collided with his role as a father. For years, he had tried to keep those 2 responsibilities separate. Now the permanent exclusion had made that impossible. He had protected the institution, but feared he had confirmed every accusation Harry had ever made about duty always coming before family. Harry paced across the room in California and said he wanted to call his father immediately. Meghan stopped him with a single question. What could another conversation possibly change when the restrictions were written to survive the current reign? She cared little about missed ceremonies or royal appearances. Her greatest concern was Archie and Lilibet because the decision could leave them knowing royal life only through photographs, headlines, and stories told from afar. Harry insisted Charles might still listen, not as king, but as a father. Meghan quietly replied that the sovereign had already answered through a document deliberately designed to outlive him. William stood beside Catherine reviewing the guest list for an upcoming private family gathering. Near the bottom, he found Harry's name. The Prince of Wales believed the monarchy could no longer survive if private disagreements, personal pain, and confidential discussions repeatedly became public battles. He rested the pen against the page, hesitated for a brief moment, then calmly drew a single line through Harry's name. Catherine noticed the tension on his face. William told her the decision was not driven by revenge. It was about protecting the institution. Yet his voice faltered when he admitted that his brother might never forgive him. Meghan later learned that William had personally supported the clause extending the ban into future reigns. She immediately understood the deeper meaning. The separation was no longer temporary, emotional, or dependent upon Charles. It had officially become part of the monarchy's future. Harry listened without saying a word. Then he reopened the approval papers and noticed a reference to an earlier confrontation at Windsor. One private meeting, months before the public announcement, had quietly set the entire process into motion. When that forgotten confrontation was finally reconstructed, it became clear that the permanent exclusion had not begun with a palace announcement. It had started with a single sentence spoken behind a locked door. The palace did not wake up one morning and suddenly decide to remove Harry and Meghan from royal life. The road toward permanent separation had begun months earlier during a private meeting at Windsor that had been presented as one final opportunity for peace. There were no cameras. No public statement followed. Yet one request, one refusal, and one sharply delivered warning transformed that conversation into the point of no return. Harry arrived at Windsor Castle believing he had been invited to repair what had been broken. Charles waited beside William with only one senior aide positioned outside the locked door, close enough to be called in if necessary, but far enough away to hear nothing. The discussion was intended to establish clear boundaries for future family contact, ceremonial attendance, and confidential conversations. Ceremonial attendance referred to participation in official royal occasions such as state services, memorial events, and national celebrations. The meeting also needed to determine how Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet could remain connected to the family without reopening the same wounds that had already divided them. Harry opened the folder placed before him and immediately presented one condition. Before he or Meghan would consider returning to any royal role, the palace had to issue a written public statement acknowledging that Meghan had been mistreated by the institution. He insisted that private sympathy was no longer enough. His wife deserved public recognition, and his children deserved proof that silence would not become part of their inheritance. Charles straightened in his chair but kept his tone calm. The king told his son he could not publish a declaration condemning the very institution he had sworn to protect, even if doing so might repair their relationship. The crown represented the monarchy itself, an institution greater than any individual sovereign. Charles admitted mistakes had been made, but refused to begin reconciliation with a statement that could weaken the institution entrusted to his care. William slowly pushed his chair back. The prince told Harry that peace could not come at the cost of forcing the monarchy to publicly accept blame. Harry answered that accountability was not punishment. It was simply the foundation of trust. Their voices grew sharper as Charles watched the final chance for understanding slowly disappear. Harry stood up, closed the folder, and warned that if the family refused accountability, the truth would continue emerging, with or without the palace's permission. Then he walked out. The door slammed hard enough to shake the brass handle, leaving the king staring silently at the empty chair where his younger son had been sitting. William immediately called in the waiting aide and instructed him to prepare the first draft of a permanent access framework, a formal policy controlling future entry, attendance, and communication. Charles refused to approve it. But that refusal would not survive the next confrontation. When father and son met again, Meghan entered the room beside Harry. What followed was no longer another failed negotiation. It became the confrontation that convinced the palace the conflict could no longer be contained through promises alone. The final confrontation took place without cameras, advisors, or prepared speeches. Harry and Meghan entered believing they had been invited to discuss a genuine path back into family life. William arrived already knowing that the permanent exclusion document was being prepared. Charles sat between them, hoping family ties could still succeed where royal protocol had failed. Within minutes, the discussion became one of the most painful private confrontations the modern royal family had ever experienced. Charles arranged the meeting at Clarence House and instructed every courtier to remain outside. The king wanted no official voices in the room, no advisors interrupting the discussion, and no opportunity for anyone to later blame the institution. Clarence House was both his London residence and a place where private family conversations could take place away from formal palace procedures. That mattered because Charles wanted to speak as a father before circumstances forced him to act as sovereign. Yet the sealed folder resting on the table already hinted that fatherhood was beginning to lose. William spoke first. He explained that any future relationship required complete confidentiality, no commercial use of royal connections, and no private family discussions ever becoming public again. Meghan leaned forward and calmly asked whether those conditions applied only to her and Harry, while palace sources remained free to influence damaging stories through the press. William replied that nobody could control every newspaper, but everyone could control what they personally chose to reveal. Meghan answered that silence had always been demanded from those who felt wounded, never from those protecting the system itself. Harry turned toward his father. He asked whether Charles still saw him as a son, or as a threat the crown needed to contain. The king hesitated. That brief silence hurt more than any immediate answer could have. Before Charles could speak, Meghan noticed the title printed across the sealed folder: Future Access and Exclusion Protocol. The protocol outlined the official rules determining who could enter royal residences, attend family occasions, and receive institutional access. She looked directly at William and immediately understood. The palace had prepared for failure before they had even arrived. William admitted he had requested the document after the earlier Windsor meeting. The future king explained that the monarchy could no longer survive endless cycles of private reconciliation followed by public controversy. Harry stood and faced his brother. William remained perfectly still. "Are you truly willing to lose me forever?" Harry asked. William met his eyes and quietly replied, "I'm prepared to stop losing everyone else." Charles struck the table once with the palm of his hand. Not out of anger, but desperation. He ordered both sons to sit down. Neither obeyed immediately. Meghan watched the king's expression tighten as he realized the family had moved beyond negotiation. Harry eventually stepped back while William remained standing beside the sealed folder. The meeting ended without reconciliation. Even then, the final authority still belonged to Charles. He refused to sign the exclusion order that night. But William carried another confidential file, one containing evidence the king had never been shown. The brothers had already reached their conclusion. Now only the father's signature remained, and securing it would require one final revelation. Charles did not approve the permanent exclusion immediately. For several days, the document remained locked inside a red dispatch box while the king searched for another solution. Then William arrived with a separate file containing confidential warnings, broken agreements, security concerns, and private assurances that had repeatedly failed. The file described far more than a family disagreement. It presented the king with a choice between protecting one son and protecting the institution he had inherited from his mother. Charles sat alone with William and untied the ribbon around the file. The red dispatch box was the secure case traditionally used to deliver sensitive state documents directly to the sovereign, meaning the issue had already moved beyond a personal family dispute and into formal royal authority. The king slowly read the opening page before looking across the table and asking why so much information had been kept from him. William replied that every warning had been dismissed as criticism of Harry instead of being treated as a genuine threat to the monarchy. His voice remained controlled, but the emotion beneath it was impossible to hide. The prince told his father that guilt had delayed decisions everyone else had been forced to live with. Charles accused William of turning personal pain into permanent policy, of creating lasting rules from situations that should have remained private. William calmly answered that privacy had already failed. Every broken understanding had made another crisis more likely, and every delay had convinced the palace that emotions would always outweigh consequences. Charles continued reading until he reached a signed confidentiality agreement from an earlier reconciliation attempt. The document had been a written promise that private family discussions would remain confidential and would never become public. Yet details from that meeting later appeared outside palace walls, including conversations known only to those who had been inside the room. The king stopped reading and rested one finger on the signature. William remained silent. He no longer needed to explain anything. The final pages carried the most difficult conclusion. Palace legal advisors argued that informal family arrangements could always be ignored, challenged, or reversed, while a sovereign-approved protocol would establish a lasting framework. They also warned that any compromise Charles introduced could disappear once William inherited the throne unless the heir personally endorsed it. The succession clause, the section explaining how the decision would continue under the next monarch, made the choice painfully clear. A father's mercy might survive only until the crown passed to another king. Charles reached the final page, quietly closed the file, and walked toward the window. Silence filled the room between father and son. Finally, the king turned and asked William to bring him the exclusion document. The signature that followed did far more than cancel invitations. It affected royal residences, security communications, private access, and every remaining connection Harry and Meghan still had with palace life. The pen created the permanent ban. But the first real shock came when Harry and Meghan discovered just how quickly the palace intended to enforce it. Charles did not approve the permanent exclusion immediately. For several days, the document remained locked inside a red dispatch box while the king searched for another solution. Then William arrived with a separate file containing confidential warnings, broken agreements, security concerns, and private assurances that had repeatedly failed. The file described far more than a family disagreement. It presented the king with a choice between protecting one son and protecting the institution he had inherited from his mother. Charles sat alone with William and untied the ribbon around the file. The red dispatch box was the secure case traditionally used to deliver sensitive state documents directly to the sovereign, meaning the issue had already moved beyond a personal family dispute and into formal royal authority. The king slowly read the opening page before looking across the table and asking why so much information had been kept from him. William replied that every warning had been dismissed as criticism of Harry instead of being treated as a genuine threat to the monarchy. His voice remained controlled, but the emotion beneath it was impossible to hide. The prince told his father that guilt had delayed decisions everyone else had been forced to live with. Charles accused William of turning personal pain into permanent policy, of creating lasting rules from situations that should have remained private. William calmly answered that privacy had already failed. Every broken understanding had made another crisis more likely, and every delay had convinced the palace that emotions would always outweigh consequences. Charles continued reading until he reached a signed confidentiality agreement from an earlier reconciliation attempt. The document had been a written promise that private family discussions would remain confidential and would never become public. Yet details from that meeting later appeared outside palace walls, including conversations known only to those who had been inside the room. The king stopped reading and rested one finger on the signature. William remained silent. He no longer needed to explain anything. The final pages carried the most difficult conclusion. Palace legal advisors argued that informal family arrangements could always be ignored, challenged, or reversed, while a sovereign-approved protocol would establish a lasting framework. They also warned that any compromise Charles introduced could disappear once William inherited the throne unless the heir personally endorsed it. The succession clause, the section explaining how the decision would continue under the next monarch, made the choice painfully clear. A father's mercy might survive only until the crown passed to another king. Charles reached the final page, quietly closed the file, and walked toward the window. Silence filled the room between father and son. Finally, the king turned and asked William to bring him the exclusion document. The signature that followed did far more than cancel invitations. It affected royal residences, security communications, private access, and every remaining connection Harry and Meghan still had with palace life. The pen created the permanent ban. But the first real shock came when Harry and Meghan discovered just how quickly the palace intended to enforce it. Charles did not approve the permanent exclusion immediately. For several days, the document remained locked inside a red dispatch box while the king searched for another solution. Then William arrived with a separate file containing confidential warnings, broken agreements, security concerns, and private assurances that had repeatedly failed. The file described far more than a family disagreement. It presented the king with a choice between protecting one son and protecting the institution he had inherited from his mother. Charles sat alone with William and untied the ribbon around the file. The red dispatch box was the secure case traditionally used to deliver sensitive state documents directly to the sovereign, meaning the issue had already moved beyond a personal family dispute and into formal royal authority. The king slowly read the opening page before looking across the table and asking why so much information had been kept from him. William replied that every warning had been dismissed as criticism of Harry instead of being treated as a genuine threat to the monarchy. His voice remained controlled, but the emotion beneath it was impossible to hide. The prince told his father that guilt had delayed decisions everyone else had been forced to live with. Charles accused William of turning personal pain into permanent policy, of creating lasting rules from situations that should have remained private. William calmly answered that privacy had already failed. Every broken understanding had made another crisis more likely, and every delay had convinced the palace that emotions would always outweigh consequences. Charles continued reading until he reached a signed confidentiality agreement from an earlier reconciliation attempt. The document had been a written promise that private family discussions would remain confidential and would never become public. Yet details from that meeting later appeared outside palace walls, including conversations known only to those who had been inside the room. The king stopped reading and rested one finger on the signature. William remained silent. He no longer needed to explain anything. The final pages carried the most difficult conclusion. Palace legal advisors argued that informal family arrangements could always be ignored, challenged, or reversed, while a sovereign-approved protocol would establish a lasting framework. They also warned that any compromise Charles introduced could disappear once William inherited the throne unless the heir personally endorsed it. The succession clause, the section explaining how the decision would continue under the next monarch, made the choice painfully clear. A father's mercy might survive only until the crown passed to another king. Charles reached the final page, quietly closed the file, and walked toward the window. Silence filled the room between father and son. Finally, the king turned and asked William to bring him the exclusion document. The signature that followed did far more than cancel invitations. It affected royal residences, security communications, private access, and every remaining connection Harry and Meghan still had with palace life. The pen created the permanent ban. But the first real shock came when Harry and Meghan discovered just how quickly the palace intended to enforce it. The announcement was only the beginning. Within hours, invitations disappeared, security channels were closed, ceremonial records were updated, and private access permissions were withdrawn. What had initially sounded like distant palace language quickly became a painful reality. Harry and Meghan were not simply being criticized or ignored. They were being removed from the living structure of the monarchy, one guest list, one doorway, and one family connection at a time. Harry received the first official notice before breakfast. He read the document silently. His remaining authorization to enter Windsor and other protected royal residences had been cancelled with immediate effect. The authorization was the official permission allowing entry into secure royal properties and restricted areas, meaning the loss reached far beyond a simple access card. It erased the final practical connection between Harry and the places where he had grown up. He placed the access card on the kitchen counter and left his hand resting beside it for several long seconds. Meghan watched quietly. She understood that Harry was not mourning a building. He was mourning the childhood memories attached to it, the corridors connected to his mother, the rooms he had shared with William, and the private places where Charles had once been simply his father. She placed the palace notice beside the card and softly said the exclusion had finally become real. Invitations could always be replaced. Titles could still be debated. But once access itself disappeared, the family was no longer pretending the separation was temporary. The consequences continued to unfold. Palace officials removed both Harry and Meghan from future state ceremony plans, internal family coordination lists, and privately organized royal gatherings. State ceremony plans referred to the official arrangements for national services, royal events, and public duties carried out on behalf of the crown. The decision did not erase Harry's birthright or his history, but it officially ended his and Meghan's participation in royal life. Harry reached the section concerning Archie and Lilibet, and froze. The children themselves were not personally excluded. However, any future contact with the royal family would take place independently of their parents and only under arrangements approved by the sovereign. Meghan described that condition as cruel. She believed it transformed ordinary family relationships into carefully controlled access. Harry remained silent, but the expression on his face hardened when another document confirmed that the annual Balmoral summer gathering had already been reorganized. Their rooms had been reassigned. Their names had disappeared from the security manifest, the official list authorizing who could enter and remain on protected royal property. Harry immediately called Charles. The call connected. But instead of the king, a private secretary answered. Harry asked whether his father knew he was calling. The secretary paused briefly before quietly replying, "Yes." Meanwhile, William received confirmation at Kensington Palace that every stage of the enforcement process had been completed. The prince closed the briefing folder, dismissed his aide, and asked to be left alone. The decision had achieved its objective. Yet it felt nothing like victory. After the machinery of exclusion had finished its work, Charles finally reached out to his son. Not as king, but as a father who believed he had only one private truth left to share. The turning point did not arrive through lawyers, official statements, or another palace summit. It came late one evening when Charles called Harry directly from a private room and asked that neither of them record, repeat, or use the conversation against the other. For the first time in years, There were no aides listening and no prepared conditions waiting on the table. There was only a father, a son, and the irreversible choices standing between them. Charles dismissed his staff, locked the sitting room door, and used a private telephone number reserved solely for personal conversations rather than official palace business. The distinction mattered because an official call could be logged, documented, and become part of the institution's permanent record. This conversation belonged only to the two of them. William was not present. Meghan, no courtier could soften the words, and no advisor could tell either man when to stop. Harry answered with anger already filling his voice. He demanded to know why his father had encouraged reconciliation when the palace had already been preparing a permanent exclusion before their final meeting. Charles did not deny it. Instead, he admitted that he had hoped Harry would accept clear boundaries strong enough to make the document unnecessary. But after the confrontation at Clarence House, he no longer believed either side trusted the other. Without trust, he said, every future meeting carried the risk of becoming another public wound. Harry pressed further. He asked whether Charles truly believed he had betrayed the family, or whether the king had simply lacked the courage to stand against William. The question landed heavily. For years, Harry had believed his father's silence had always been a choice. This time, Charles answered without hiding behind duty. He quietly said the permanent ban was not evidence that Harry was unloved. It was proof that love had repeatedly failed to prevent further damage. Silence filled the line. Charles could hear his son's breathing. Harry offered no reply. The king waited, knowing one careless sentence could turn their private conversation into yet another battle. Finally, Harry spoke. "Then I understand. You chose the crown." Charles slowly closed his eyes before answering. "I chose the duty I could never escape." Harry did not forgive him. He did not offer peace. But for the first time, he stopped fighting the reality of the decision. The permanent exclusion would not disappear because of one emotional phone call. No hidden promise remained behind the palace's official language. The truth hurt deeply. Yet it also ended the hope that one final appeal might somehow restore everything. Charles remained on the line for another moment before quietly saying goodbye. Neither father nor son realized that the public storm had already begun. By the following morning, the private grief of one family had become a national debate about loyalty, responsibility, and the true cost of belonging to the crown. As dawn broke over London, the announcement slipped beyond the palace's control. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Newspapers replaced their front pages. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, some defending the monarchy's decision, others condemning it as an act of unnecessary cruelty. The Sussex exclusion was no longer simply a family matter. It had become a nationwide argument over whether a monarchy survives through forgiveness or through the uncompromising enforcement of its boundaries. London awoke beneath a wave of breaking headlines. British and international broadcasters described the permanent exclusion as one of the most dramatic royal family decisions of the modern era. Buckingham Palace refused to answer additional questions, repeating only that the restrictions were permanent, carried constitutional authority, and were already in effect. Constitutional authority referred to power exercised through the sovereign under the established rules governing the monarchy, giving the decision far greater weight than an ordinary family disagreement. That distinction mattered. The palace had not simply rejected Harry and Meghan emotionally. It had placed the full authority of the crown behind their removal. One newspaper captured the emotional impact of the moment. Its front page appeared entirely black, displaying a childhood photograph of Harry walking behind Princess Diana's coffin beneath the stark headline, "The final door closes." Harry saw the image on television in California and quietly turned away before Archie or Lily Bett could notice it. Meghan reached for the remote, but Harry stopped her. He wanted the broadcast to continue. He needed to understand how Britain was now being asked to remember him, not as a son or a brother, but as the young boy who had once followed his mother's coffin and had now, as a man, been permanently cast outside the institution. Outside Buckingham Palace, opposing crowds gathered behind security barriers. One woman raised a sign reading, "A crown without mercy." Nearby, another supporter waved the Union flag while shouting that William had protected the future of the monarchy. From Kensington Palace, William listened as one television commentator accused the institution of repeating the emotional distance that had once surrounded Diana. His expression tightened the moment he heard his mother's name. Even so, he refused to issue any personal response, knowing that defending himself publicly would only create another painful contest with Harry. Inside the palace, advisors quietly prepared for possible retaliation. They expected Meghan to release details from the Clarence House confrontation and feared that another public statement could deepen the crisis even further. Meghan drafted a powerful response describing the exclusion as calculated punishment. She placed the statement before Harry. He carefully read every line. After several moments of silence, he gently placed the pages down. Then he deleted the entire draft. Meghan looked at him in disbelief. Harry quietly explained that another public battle would only strengthen the palace's argument, that every private wound eventually became a public weapon. Exile had already taken his access. It had taken his place within the royal family. It had taken away every realistic hope of returning. He refused to let it take away his final decision. And by choosing silence instead of another confrontation, Harry finally proved that while the palace could control his place within the monarchy, it could never control the choices he made beyond it. The permanent exclusion did not create a true winner. Charles preserved the authority of the crown, but lost the final hope that his family might one day be whole again. William secured the boundaries he believed the monarchy desperately needed, yet accepted that his brother would remain outside those boundaries indefinitely. Meghan saw every fear she had ever held about the institution confirmed. Harry lost his place within royal life, but gained one final decision: whether exile would define his future, or whether he would finally step away from the conflict forever. Charles returned to his desk after the public reaction had begun to settle. He quietly opened the drawer containing an old photograph of his two sons. The king held it in silence for a long moment before carefully placing it back inside rather than throwing it away. His love remained. Only the closeness had disappeared. The exclusion protocol, the permanent framework governing royal access, attendance, and family contact, had officially entered the monarchy's formal structure. It would remain in force during William's future reign, meaning a change of sovereign would not automatically reopen the path back. William signed the final implementation document, while Catherine stood quietly beside him. The future king had achieved the protection he believed the institution required. Even so, his hand remained resting on the paper long after the ink had dried. He admitted to Catherine that safeguarding the crown did not feel like victory when the cost was losing his only brother. She gently reminded him that even necessary decisions could leave lasting sorrow. William understood history might one day praise his determination. But history would never carry the personal weight of Harry's absence. Meanwhile, Harry sat beside Meghan as the palace announcement continued playing quietly inside their California home. He opened the response they had prepared together, read every line one final time, then permanently deleted it. Looking toward Meghan, he quietly said they could no longer build their future around seeking acceptance from people who had already withdrawn it. She closed the palace document, reached for his hand, and told him their children deserve stability, not a life defined by endless conflict with the institution. Harry walked outside with Archie, leaving the television voices behind. His son looked up and softly asked, "Will we ever go back to the castle?" Harry stopped walking, knelt beside him, smiled gently, and answered, "No, but we'll build a home of our own." The words carried sadness, but they also carried freedom. For the first time, Harry was no longer waiting for another invitation, another apology, or another opportunity to return. The monarchy had chosen survival through separation. Harry and Meghan had chosen to build an identity beyond royal approval. The crown could close its doors with complete authority, but it could never stop those left outside from creating a different future. The palace had delivered its final decision. Harry had accepted the path beyond the monarchy. And one of the longest, most painful chapters in modern royal history had finally reached its conclusion. Charles remained at his desk long after the headlines had faded. The old photograph of his sons rested quietly inside the drawer, untouched but never forgotten. He understood that protecting the institution had demanded a sacrifice no father ever hoped to make. The crown had endured. His family had not. William stood silently beside the window at Kensington Palace. The documents had been signed. The procedures had been completed. The boundaries had been secured. Yet none of it felt like triumph. He believed he had protected the future of the monarchy, but the cost would remain with him for the rest of his life. Meghan looked toward Harry as he watched Archie playing outside. For the first time in years, there was no discussion about returning, no debate about invitations, and no expectation that another meeting might repair everything that had been lost. Harry quietly smiled at his children. He finally understood that peace would never come from waiting for acceptance. It would come from building a future that no longer depended on royal approval. The palace had made its choice. He had now made his. History would continue debating whether the decision protected the monarchy or permanently divided a family. But for those who had lived through it, the consequences were no longer political. They were deeply personal. The Crown had preserved its institution. Harry and Meghan had chosen a life beyond it. Neither side walked away unchanged. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest royal family updates. We'll see you in the next video.